So, because this is part two of Antebellum America and Modern America, the parallels, I should start the podcast off how I did the previous one, and that is a fun history story before it gets real heavy, and it will get heavy later. But for now, let me just ask you something. Do you think people are obsessed with celebrity culture today? Do you think that people go a little too extreme? I certainly do, and yeah, I stand by that. But to challenge you if you do, and I'm challenging myself, let's look at a story, 1849, a true story. This really happened. Let's go to New York City, the Astor Place Opera House. If you think people today would be so extreme for their support of their favorite actors, you have not met the American people of the antebellum era. So, if you listen to my previous podcast, you'll know that the shows, nightlife, were booming in the antebellum period. I didn't touch on it too much, but one aspect of the booming nightlife was the theater, plays and productions. Actors were getting quite famous in their roles. Some of them very famous for uh, some of them for blackface, some of them for playing roles of Indians, others just uh, regular plays, right? And it was typical that these actors did all sorts of these shows. But there were the actors who rose to the ranks, and so we understand the great um, feuds between celebrities, you know, today, right? Right now, I'm just so out of touch with celebrity culture now. I don't even know who to bring up. Um, you get it. Think of an extreme feud in celebrity culture, and let me and just ask yourself if this measures up. Um, so in May of 1849, people began to riot out of their support for these two actors. Now, there were these two rival actors. One of them was an American. His name was Edwin Forrest, probably the showman, the number one guy, the Duke of acting in the United States. And then you had a guy by the name of William McCready, who was the counterpart, the British counterpart, the Duke of his country, and both toured each other's countries, doing plays, doing their best work, and a great rivalry um, began kind of organically. Uh, and as fun as we like to think that celebrity feuds are, and as crazy as it is that a riot actually happened, um, it's kind of sad to realize that actually people died in this riot and a bunch of people were injured, brutally injured, and people ended up thinking that people saw Edwin Forrest, the American, identifying with the working class, and the elite class. They at the time they associated elitism with English culture, and the elites sided with the Englishman, William McCready, and so you had this big ol' riot at a show over class struggle, and it was all over, and it was all sparked by, I should say, celebrity feuds. So, if we are to learn anything from history, it's let's be careful about the celebrities that we support and how seriously we support them. We don't want to be falling into that trap like our ancestors did. Okay, so to the podcast today. Like I said, part two to the previous one. I highly, highly, highly recommend you go listen to the first one before you listen to this one, as the first one will do a really good job of painting a picture for today's subject. Today's subject is going to be very heavy, probably very challenging. I have not heard any historian really make this claim that I am going to make. And you might say, Trevor, maybe you're bad at history if you're the only lay historian making this claim. To which I say, probably. I only have a bachelor's degree. But I stick to it because it is highly, highly, highly against progressive dogma, and progressivism overruns the education system of today. It's not even close. So any historian worth their salt today, at least recognized in the history community, is certainly not going to be holding these positions, because if they did, their jobs would be, um, they would be significantly put at risk, their livelihoods, things of that nature. So let us proceed. Now, again, highly recommend you listen to the first one. The main point of, I should say, the crux of my podcast is going to be scripted, because I want to make sure that I'm saying what I mean to say in the best way possible. And the best way to do that is to write it out, and you're not just speaking off the cuff. And it should save us a little time. Now watch the podcast be an hour and a half, because that's how I roll. All right, let's begin. Over the last few decades, countries have dealt with rapidly changing economic and political global landscape. Antebellum America, an often forgotten period of American history, bears many striking resemblances to the modern day. It was during this period that the United States was figuring out how to be a representative democracy. It was figuring out how it was going to put it into practice, and many other countries were adopting similar governments. This period also saw rapid changes in technology, transportation, media, communication, and labor. We have also seen incredible advancement in technology, media, communication, and labor. Again, I go over all of these similarities in the previous podcast. Because of these parallels, the antebellum era can offer many lessons and warnings to us today. Again, some of which I covered last time. Interestingly, there appears to be a similarity between institutional power of antebellum America and the present day. The parallel in focus is the, quote, slave power of the antebellum period and the, what I would call, progressive power of today. If this parallel is valid, then I believe it will provide us with some things we can expect to see in the coming years. So, let's go to the antebellum period and take a look at slave power. From the North's perspective, the South began to acquire advantages relating to slavery in the federal government that rendered the North feeling increasingly powerless. This became known at the time as slave power. This is not a term that historians came up with. This was a term used by the people in that time. The first and most blatant example of the slave power thesis was the 3/5 Compromise. In order to get Southern states to ratify the U.S. Constitution, it was enacted that every 5 slaves in a state would count as 3 people. The South received more weight in Congress, yet the supposed constituents, slaves, of those additional representatives had 0 say in politics. This appeared to the North as an unjustified grab of a larger stake in the federal government. Another example of slave power working was the government's reaction to the famous incident with the Charleston lynchmen in 1835. In the early 1830s, the American Anti-Slavery Society launched an enormous postal campaign against slavery. When this anti-slavery mail reached Charleston, South Carolina in 1835, a vigilance committee seized the mail and subsequently burned it publicly with hundreds of spectators and celebrators. The government's reaction was far more appalling to Northerners, however. Tampering with mail was just as illegal back then as it is today, but none of the offenders in Charleston saw any consequences from federal authorities. In fact, Jackson, the president at the time, sought to censure abolitionist literature in the mail as a result of the Charleston incident. During the year following the Charleston incident, Congress instituted the gag rule. This rule forbade any congressman from introducing the topic of slavery to be discussed in Congress. So, former So formal political motions against slavery had been openly curbed in government. Perhaps the cinder block that broke the camel's back was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This was by far the South's most severe act of dominance over the North. Excuse me. The legislation barred Northerners from helping escaped slaves. It placed responsibility on Northerners to cooperate in returning slaves, and it issued penalties to anyone who disrupted the return process. For the first time, the North had to actively prop up the Southern institution of slavery, essentially because the government said so. As we see, the U.S. was geographically bifurcated on the issue of slavery. However, they were not bifurcated in the realm of political institutions. Southern political encroachment became so clear that it did not require someone to be nearly as radical as the radical slave abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison to see it. Southern interests were repeatedly placed before Northern interests, and it left Northerners believing that slaveholders were pulling the strings of the federal government more than the North. They became disenfranchised by slave power, and this disenfranchisement would eventually rally Northerners to back Abraham Lincoln and other more assertive plays. Now, onto progressive power. When we look back to the antebellum era, we tend to think of it as an even political split, but in effect it was not. The same goes for the present day. Progressives possess power in some of the most powerful institutions in this country. And I should say that what I mean by progressives are not people who are just simply ideologically liberal. I mean progressives who are very, very far left, and those who identify as such, of course. The first and most easily recognizable progressive stronghold is the corporate media. Most of the mainstream news media leans far to the left. Cable news networks such as MSNBC, CBS, ABC, and CNN are quite progressive. Also, the most influential newspapers such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and even the Associated Press lean left. What's dangerous is that many outlets tout themselves as more or less objective. However, consumers will be exposed to progressive bias based on what the outlet chooses to report and not to report. So, maybe you read a piece that sounds like it's not very opinionated, but in reality, they're choosing what to tell you and what not to tell you. What facts are relevant to the left agenda and what facts are not. They make that decision and they include that information accordingly. Along the same vein, the majority of Hollywood leans significantly to the left. An open conservative can expect to be on the blacklist and scrounging for jobs. And it's also very important to realize the incredible power that art plays in society. And one of the most pervasive and powerful forms of art in our modern time is movies and TV shows. And if you think that the ideology of the left is not seeping into just about every big movie, every big TV show, then I frankly have a hard time believing that you've watched any of the TV shows. But we can't focus on that too long. We got a bigger point to make. The most influential institutional power, however, is the education system. American universities are overwhelmingly progressive. As recently as 2018, professors registered Democrat outnumbered registered Republican professors 10-1. Universities supply labor to a large multitude of industries. Public school teachers, government bureaucrats, and corporate-level employees are among the many professions that require a bachelor's degree to enter into. So, medium to large companies and the incredibly huge government bureaucracy are being steered by people who have undergone advanced education by significantly left-leaning universities. Not to mention, most kids who attend public school will certainly be taught by teachers who will likely lean left. Additionally, the universities feed labor to tech companies. These companies, which hold massive cultural power, have actively censored non-progressive voices. Now let's see how slave power and progressive power compare, and if at all. In the antebellum era, Northerners felt that their backs were against the wall when dealing with slave power. It's not difficult to see non-progressives feeling the same way, as progressives hold power in media, entertainment, and education, along with everything that flows out of education. What's fascinating is the similarity between the gag rule and cancel culture today. As slavery was barred from political discourse, so too has many perspectives been barred from public discourse. If a person publicizes an opinion contrary to currently accepted progressive dogma, then he or she runs the risk of losing their job and social status. There also exists a reasonable comparison between the Charleston lynchment incident and big tech. The government allowed the destruction of free speech in the form of postage with the Charleston lynchman, and the sitting president of this time subsequently sought to continue to stifle free speech. Comparatively, big tech, which has amassed more power than many governments in history, has openly censored dissenting viewpoints. Slave power was ultimately broken up by the Civil War. Another civil war seems incredibly unlikely for a myriad of reasons that this podcast is not concerned about. However, progressive power appears to be following a similar trend of heading towards a big breakup. Large decentralization, thanks to the internet, shows signs of being the antidote to progressive power, not necessarily a large-scale civil war. For example, large swaths of educational resources on humanities, and by the way, humanities tend to be the most progressive out of college subjects. Anyways, these educational resources on humanities can be easily accessible through the internet, and consumers are far more likely to encounter a wider diversity of views, thanks to the internet, again. Traditional mainstream media ratings have been dropping. Americans even appear to have growing distrust of traditional corporate mainstream media. Viewers are flocking to more independent sources, such as the Joe Rogan Experience, for example. Rogan's podcast serves as a great example because its ratings dwarf the ratings of mainstream news outlets. Plus, he hosts guests that range from as far left to Bernie Sanders to as far right as Ben Shapiro and Representative Dan Crenshaw, with most guests being closer to the middle. Lastly, it's worth mentioning the large number of protests against mask and vaccine mandates, policies typically supported by progressives during the coronavirus pandemic. Many Americans took to the streets, school board meetings, and government halls to protest mandates, and this is to say that people were against the progressive power pushing the mask and vaccine mandates. Is there something that slave power can teach us anything at all about progressive power? Slave power shows us that when institutional power is overly weighted by one side, it's destined to fail. If progressive power fails, it will be similar to slave power, not in the sense of a civil war. That is, it will fall slowly as more people wake up to it, and then all at once. The key difference between slave power and progressive power is that the former is propped up at the expense of human rights, those of slaves, and the latter is propped up at the expense of freedom of ideas. A free society should not want any one ideology to dominate. If progressive power finds a way to become even stronger and more pervasive, then it will inevitably gain another similarity with slave power, and that is, it will become propped up at the expense of human rights. And that is my assessment to the trends of institutional power that I see between the antebellum era and the modern day. And I want to make it clear at the now that I have finished this, that all claims that I have made will be backed by sources. You can find all of those sources in the links below. I have many of them because I don't want to just be making assertions. I want to have them backed. So if you're interested in checking out these sources, I highly recommend it. And also, when I go over historical events, I cover those in the links as well, in case you're curious to go more in depth on these stories of history. They are fascinating. Okay, now since that was rather short, and I mean short for a Resurgency podcast, I would like to go over some recent examples of progressive power, perhaps to make it a little bit more palpable. I think in my speech, if you will, it kind of appeared that I'm talking about progressive power in a more abstract way. I try to bring in examples, but it maybe perhaps sounds a little bit abstract. So let's look at a few more concrete examples. I think a good indication of progressive power actually comes from when it is seriously threatened, and the best example of that recently happening has been Elon Musk making a move to buy Twitter outright. And the wonderful thing about Musk is that he recognizes that Twitter has been censoring dissenting opinions. That is, opinions that dissent from left-wing dogma, or at least are permitted by left-wing ideology. And he believes that Twitter actually has the capability of being a wonderful place, a wonderful town square, if you will, the best place for the freedom of ideas, ideas to clash with one another, and for ideas to compete with one another, and the best ideas to win. After all, that is a fundamental principle of Western civilization, and that is something that he seeks to put in, and we support him in doing that. And he was rather successful in his moves to take the company, to buy it out. Though the deal is looking to go through in October, it seems that he has hit some stumbling blocks. Now, first there is the stumbling block that it seems that the company, Twitter, was lying to its investors about how big it was, mainly because of spam accounts, non-human accounts, things like that. So he has to reassess the deal. Who knows what that will do to the grand scheme of things. However, it's interesting to see the way in which the institutions reacted to Elon Musk. Now, many people in prominent positions of society, whether they're politicians, wealthy folks, cultural icons, have come out and denounced Elon Musk. They've said some pretty awful and nasty things about him. Okay, what does that do? That's expected, if you will. But the issue is where I see these investigations that are starting on Musk. So Musk, in his business savvy, you don't become the richest man in the world being dumb. In his savvy in the business realm, in his expertise in the business realm, he was able to enter into this Twitter space and overcome it, and actually looks like he's going to seize power, to seize control of Twitter, and the government's not too happy about that. There are government. There's what are these? Bureaucracies, if you will, that departments, if you would, departments in the government that are investigating Elon Musk over these things, and I just have to ask the question, what prompted such serious investigations, and why are they so quick to investigate Elon Musk? Certainly, there's no indication that Elon Musk made any illegal moves, any wrong moves. Certainly, if he did, people who are on the left, who hold great cultural and institutional power, would have been the first to say it. We would have learned about it immediately, but we have not. So why is the government investigating Elon Musk? And that goes back to what I had said earlier. The education system, mainly universities, are overwhelmingly progressive. They are overwhelmingly far left leaning, and they are creating that they are disseminating this leftist ideology onto its students, and these students are going forth into the world, and that includes into bureaucracy, because these bureaucrats are all educated, and they've been educated at these very liberal institutions. And they bring that bias with them, and it has been the liberals, the far left-leaning people, as I have been calling them, the progressives, who have been the most hateful of Elon Musk buying this. So I see the connection there, that there is the government bureaucracy who does not like what Elon Musk is doing. Why? Because he wants free speech. And progressives do not want free speech. They censor people with dissenting opinions. And again, go check the links in the description below for evidence on that. Also, another thing, very interesting, sexual assault claims have been made on Musk. Now, I believe it is hard to determine whether these claims are true, because if you actually go into the story, you find out that the media found out from this person who said that this person said that this happened. It's very far removed. It happened a few years ago, and it's suspicious that the amount of money they claimed that was paid to hush this person was, let's be honest here, it was pocket change for Elon Musk, and certainly the wealthiest person in the world, he could get away with taking a lot more money from him if he did do these things. But that's not a full dismissal of the sexual assault. It doesn't, I don't think it favors that conclusion very well. But perhaps the most troublesome thing of these claims is the timing of it, because why on earth would all of this come out when Musk is, or at the same time that Musk is trying to overthrow a leftist stronghold, a progressive stronghold? Why? No, does anyone see that connection at all? And what's interesting is actually a few days before the claims were publicized, Musk tweeted, he's like, they're going to come and attack me. Get ready for it. He made very interesting statements about, well, I might die as a result of this. Just know that, it was not suspicious activity, right? That there was things that he was saying. He saw it coming, and again, it's hard to believe these sexual assault claims when they're being manipulated to try to stop Musk from acquiring a progressive stronghold. All right. Now the next example of progressive power. I think the Roe v. Wade leak is actually a good example of progressive power. Now, I covered the Roe v. Wade leak in a live stream, a past live stream. It was my second live stream, so I encourage you to go check that out, where we take a look at the pro-choice movement, and I don't take apart pro-choice arguments. I already did that in another podcast, but we just give an honest look at the pro-choice position, and we take it for what it is. But nonetheless, the Roe v. Wade leak, I think, does indicate something very troubling about the institutional power. Now, the far left-leaning news media has claimed that they want to claim that there's a possibility that it was actually a conservative on the bench, someone who's working for a conservative justice who leaked this this document. I think that's absolute BS, because any conservative with a thinking mind, and anyone conservative minded involved in that high level of government, is going to be smart enough to realize that if you publicize this, you're going to encounter extreme hate, especially if you publicize it before the decision really comes down. that's when people are going to be the most hateful and the most quick to act. It's because they think that they might be able to scare you enough, to intimidate you enough to change your mind. Absolute hogwash that it's a conservative who leaked it. Absolutely, it was a left-leaning employee of one of these justices, someone who thought that they could intimidate and browbeat at least one of the conservative justices to change their vote on the Roe v. Wade on the case that would overturn Roe v. Wade. Maybe I forgot to mention the Roe v. Wade case looks like it will be overturned. The case that's challenging it looks like it will succeed in overturning Roe v. Wade. But I have to ask this question: Will the leaker face punishment? And my thoughts are, if the shoe was on the other foot, and if this was somehow happening to Democrats, I believe it would be they would chalk this up as the biggest betrayal of democracy, of America in history. It would be brought to that level, right? Every news outlet would be saying that there needs to be investigations. The person who leaked this needs to be brought to justice, right? It would be a whole ordeal. But there's no concern for the integrity of our political institutions when it serves their interests, when it serves the left's interests. It's just how it is. And no one on the left is calling for investigations. And I should admit here that I think if the shoe was on the other foot, I would hope that if a conservative staff member did something like this, to try to intimidate liberal justices into changing their minds, I would hope that the right would have the integrity to say that this needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be justice needs to be brought. But so far, no updates on the leaker. I think it's incredible that we still don't really know who it is. We may not ever know who did it, at least not publicly, and they may never face punishment at all. And of course, this is because the corporate media, the progressive media, has this leaker's interests in mind. They are not stirring up the public to demand for justice in this way. I think if the media were to stir up justice, or stir up the public to bring justice to bear, I think investigations would be a lot more prompt and fruitful. But that's not what we see. I think the most telling aspect of this is the protests, the intimidation itself. People frustrated that they will no longer have the right to kill unborn babies, and because they worship the god of the god of autonomy of themselves, and that anything and anyone who doesn't bow to themselves that threatens it, they should be scorned and hated. Even the fetus itself that's killed, and anyone who threatens to take away that privilege that they get. It's not at all right, but that privilege that they get. So these protesters have gone after these justices. They've been protesting. Pro-choice folks have been protesting these justices, but not just out in public areas. No, at their private residences. And the interesting thing is it is illegal on 2 counts to do this. One, you cannot intimidate Supreme Court justices in their in their practice, I should say, in doing their job to serve justice, to deliver to deliver interpretations. That was easy for me to say, on the Constitution, to make rulings um, on cases that will affect society. It's illegal to intimidate justices on that, as they come to form decisions on that. And it's also illegal to protest in private residences, in most places. But where are the police? Where are the authorities stopping these protesters? They're nowhere to be seen. Now, thankfully, there's not been a ton of these people. I mean, certainly enough to annoy the crap out of these justices. And I think, was it Justice Alito? Forgive me if that's not the right justice, but I think it was Justice Alito who had to be taken to a different place, an undisclosed location that was more secure. If it wasn't him, then maybe was it John Roberts? I don't know. I don't know. Forgive me if I don't have the correct one there. And what's interesting is that the justice or justices who live in Virginia are actually being protected, as they should be, because it is illegal to protest in private residences. And so the Republican governor of Virginia has said that that will not be tolerated, as he should. But no, I think because of progressive power, the leaker will not experience any justice. Our system will not experience any justice from the harm that this leak has done. This is unprecedented. It's never happened before in history. What precedent does that set moving forward? But I think it's hard to be hopeful for justice to be done in this regard. Again, because progressives control the bureaucracy. They control these investigative agencies. And the intimidation that these justices have experienced, personal intimidation, many of them may not be protected, and those who have been intimidating them may not actually see justice themselves. Now, I say this being a few weeks out after the leak, so I believe the protesting has died down. Haven't seen any major updates on it, but I think that serves as a very real and palpable example of progressive power. And the last one that I want to focus on of the progressive power is grooming in schools, in public education. This radical gender and sexual ideology that is very pervasive in far left thought. I don't even think people who would identify as centrists or slightly left of center really agree with all of this nonsense. In fact, I think studies are showing that most Americans believe that this is absolute nonsense, but far left gender ideology, sexual ideology, is being pushed in public schools. People like to say that, oh, this is just about telling kids that, some kids have mommy and daddies, and some kids have daddies and daddies, and some kids have mommy and mommy, or whatever. They like to portray that it's just that simple. They also like to say that, you know, people on the right, they're the ones who make it about sex. We just want to tell them that, not all parents are heterosexual or heterosexual couples. The people on the right are the ones making it about sex. They're the real perverts. Yeah, good one. No, that's absolutely not at all what's happening. By very, very good investigations from journalists, we have seen conferences of teachers meeting throughout the country, just recently, really, and this has been going on for some years now, but just recently, um, there was a government funded conference for public school educators. And if you watch these videos of these teachers, of the people putting on this conference, they're openly talking about um, sex, masturbation, transgenderism, and all of these things, and they're open about the fact that this applies to kids of all ages, and they're unapologetic in it. And I think even the most disgusting part about it is that they're so open about their sexual lives, their personal sexual lives, and some of them make it they state that, yeah, we I talk about that with my kids. Now maybe they don't talk about the deep perversity that they explore, but they touch on it. And the point is, you shouldn't even touch it with a 100-foot pole, right? And before I get into it, I would recommend the coverage that Matt Walsh has done on this topic. He has many videos where he is showing you these conferences and these teachers who are talking about radical sexual and gender ideology um, openly wanting to bring it into the curriculum for children. And he does a just an absolutely superb job of commenting on it. And I think if you want a good conservative commentary on it, I would recommend you reach out, not reach out to him, but to go listen to him, because I think he can provide a better one than I can. And the point of this podcast is not really to get into the weeds of that, um, but this radical gender and sexual ideology is being spread. There is an active effort in public education for it to spread and for it to be taught to all children of all ages. Um, and and again, to get to the point of this podcast, where does that come from? It comes from the fact that progressives hold a very serious amount of power in this country. And I think just just the amount of power they hold in the education system alone is enough. And really, that's what has fed the whole thing, right? The people who are in the mainstream media, the people who are in the bureaucracies, the people who are at the corporate level of companies, they're all being educated by the university system. Um, and and so that's really where this comes from, is the university system, the education system. And so these universities are pumping out teachers, right? You got to have a college degree to teach at a public university, or not a public university. You have to have a college degree to teach at a public school. It's no coincidence. It's absolutely no coincidence that far left power over the education system, the university system, has resulted in the far and radical gender and sexual ideology being spread and taught in schools, in public schools today. There's no coincidence there. There's no mistaking it. Um, and so, the and some closing thoughts to the examples I've brought up and to the sort of speech I gave in the first half. Um, these, I hope I made it clear how easily progressive power has assert itself at the top. Um, right, how easy it is to be canceled is a great showcase of that. Um, and what has been sacrificed from this, um, the thing that we lose from progressive power, is a freedom of ideas. and we lose a lot from it. I believe. I think there's um, perversion of justice, perversion um, of love, perversion of freedom, perversion of individuality, perversion of spirituality, and um, there's a lot of harm done to individuals who buy into this ideology. It's hard to see people who really commit to this ideology as truly happy people. Um, but but all of the ways that progressive power infects society could be combated by freedom of ideas. If the freedom of ideas reasserts itself as the cornerstone of society, no coincidence at all why it's our First Amendment, then I believe this country has a shot. Now, I mentioned it in the first half that I don't actually think that there's going to be a hot civil war. I think there's going to be a breakup of some kind. I don't think it's going to be so easily cut down the middle. And I don't mean that ideologically, I mean that geographically. I don't think it's going to be cut so evenly. My guess is it's just going to be a lot of decentralization where power just dissipates throughout localities. And frankly, there's a real risk that comes via violence and chaos and destruction. And we do not want that. We pray that doesn't happen. We pray for mercy on our society. But I don't think it's going to be necessarily a hot civil war. It's not going to be so easily seen who's one and who's against the other. And I think even the biggest reason why it may not turn hot at all, why it likely won't turn hot at all, is because most people don't actually buy into this progressive power. And the beautiful thing is that people are starting to push back against this progressive power. It's been beautiful to see parents stand up for children's education as radical racial theory, radical gender and sexual theory has been pushed on children. Parents are standing up for it. They're not going to have it. And that's exactly why, great example of this, Glenn Youngkin's victory as the governor in Virginia. That was the pivotal issue of that campaign, and he won on it because people were not going to let these corrosive and dangerous ideologies infect their children. And let me just go out on a tangent and say this. Progressives have, I believe, I have seen, they have this arrogance about them that they believe that they are really enlightened, that they're really forward in their thinking. They're very modern. They're very cutting edge, right? God forbid they be connected to any sort of historical ideology, right? The traditions of our past are oppressive, right? And they think that their ideology is better because it's somehow more educated, it's more developed in the education system, and because of that, they believe they're right. I mean, I could see why they would think they're right based off of those presuppositions, but I think there's a belief in there that if these people who are more middle of America just were educated enough on this, that they would come to see it. They would not resist it. And I think this whole issue over children and children's education is a great example of, no, most Americans, you don't have to be a conservative. Most Americans see right through this. We see exactly what it's teaching, and we're saying no. We're saying it's BS, and we're saying you could go kick rocks. Um, so so again, I do stand hopeful. To bring it back to my original closing thoughts, I do stand hopeful, because if you're not hopeful, then what's the point of it all, right? What's the point of this sort of fight? But I stand hopeful because people are not people don't want to lie down and just take it, as we see with children's education. Another great example, I just got to drop this in there. Um, Netflix, which over the last few years has released very far left films, very woke films. They're starting to get away from it, and they're starting to release films that are not so woke. Some films that challenge wokeness. They're giving comedians who really challenge wokeness a platform. And these aren't films that are conservative. They're not comedians that are conservative by any means. They just don't buy into the woke progressive ideology. And Netflix said to its workers, if you don't like it, you should probably seek employment elsewhere. Because when you, a great phrase, when you go woke, you go broke. People aren't buying into it. They don't want to be fed. They don't want to be preached at by this nonsensical ideology. Ideologies, rather, far left ideologies. So they're not going to support it with their money. And Netflix is a great example of that. So I think there's a lot to be hopeful for. When progressive power seems to be at its peak, which it seems to be right now, I think the resistance to that is perhaps even more promising. Um, and and so I would encourage you to remain hopeful, to pray alongside with me, um, for this country, for grace and for truth to go forward, and for strength, because people will hate the truth, and they will do very nasty and disturbing things to those who speak it. It might even get worse before it gets better. And um, and Jesus said, um, "Those, was it those who have hated you, those who hate you have hated me first." You know, I'm speaking mainly to Christians now. We are called to carry our cross, and part of that cross is persecution. Um, and perhaps saying no to progressive power is going to be painful. It was painful for people in the North who weren't going to stand up and just roll over to slave power. It was painful for them. They had to fight for it in the form of a civil war. Is our fight going to take that form? I don't think so, but it's going to take something, some sort of form. And I think it'll be hard, but in the grand scheme of history, I think for the better, because truth will prevail. All right. So, with that being said, I thank you so much for listening to this podcast. If you absolutely hated every single second of it, and you think that I'm a raging lunatic and a terrible, awful, mean person, I want you to take a deep breath, recognize that I am another human being, and then let me know what you think. I'd be interested to hear dissenting opinions. As someone who advocates for freedom of speech and freedom of ideas, who would I be to discourage dissenting opinions? So feel free to drop a comment, and if it's not so vile and nasty, I might address it in the next podcast. If you agree, let me know. If you see a point that I made that you think could be expanded on more, and you want to expand on that in the comments, I'd be happy to hear. If you have a question on this, definitely drop it. I can address that in the next podcast. Maybe you want some clarification. Just anything. I'm really open for it. Also, remember, the Resurgency podcast is supposed to be a dialogical podcast, meaning my goal is for a good chunk of the direction that this podcast goes in to be crowd steered. I'm not going to give you the wheel. I'm not going to do that. Who would I be to do that? But but no, I definitely want um, the topics discussed in this podcast for the audience to have a big say in that. And I will definitely oblige that. So all right, if you liked it, then drop a like and subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell, all that good YouTube stuff, and share it. I'd love for you to share this with folks that you think could benefit from it, whether you think they might disagree or whether you might think that they would agree. I think if I have spoken truth today, then it will benefit everyone who listens to it. All right. Thank you for listening. You take care, and I will see you in the next podcast.